So today we're going to get to our first kind of tools lecture, right? If you wanted to visualize 2D scalar fields, here's the different ways that are known to do that, and which are better at certain things, worse at certain things, to start to understand how you would pick when you're designing your visualizations. And then homework one is actually posted. It's 500 megabyte download. Yeah, that's the other data sets. And so go ahead and download it from on campus if you can, and make sure that you can open it and everything is working, so you can start trying out these techniques right away. I sent you instructions and email. Anybody not get email from me with the homework instructions? Right, but you are not.
But I don't actually need them. So
but
yeah.
you should be on the mailing list.
But I'm not.
All right, so
But I
put
think
you
I
on the
didn't
mailing
email
list.
you, so I think it's my fault.
All right, so email me and I'll put you on the mailing
Yeah.
list. So you're paired up, and most teams are 2. There's one team of 3 because there's an odd number of people in the class. And we're ready to go with that. All right, so first we're going to look at some examples, as usual. So this is looking at vascular structures. And I was mentioning, before that sometimes it's not how realistic visualization is, but how useful it is that counts. And so this is saying, okay, it turns out that for diagrams of things like the engine in your car or vascular structures, having silhouette rendering can be more easily understood than just a photograph, right? When you're actually looking at the thing, it can be easier because you can move around and have stereo, but this actually can highlight what's going on. So there's a couple things we're doing here. One is shadows. And so the shadows here are as if you were kind of doing a pen and ink drawing, and then the silhouettes are that way as well. And so this is showing the boundaries and kind of dark areas as a way of understanding, and then using color to nominally encode the different ones. So you can separate objects, you can see which is in front and back, and understand the 3D depth relationship between these things. And then they try a couple of different approaches to understand artificial depth cues, right? So here, the closer it is, the more dense that stripe pattern is, and the further it is, the less dense it is. And here they try to, with a texture, directly encode the distance between 2 objects, right? And so you don't have to infer the distance by understanding the 3D shape. It's directly textured on, but you can have a spot texture, then a stripe texture, and a node texture. It kind of gives you a 3D understanding. This is an approach that builds on a technique that was, called magic lenses. It was basically the idea is you've got one view that's the context and another view that you can aim with your mouse that shows you some other viewpoint. This particular, what they're doing is showing you an X-ray view through the outside so you can see what's going on behind, right? And this is still dealing with the issue of in 3D, how do you trade off occlusion for confusion, right? If you don't have occlusion, everything's confusing, but if you do have occlusion, you can't see anything. And so this is doing a couple things. One is it's letting you highlight an area, and the other thing is it's doing interactively, right? So you can kind of look around at a particular location and see what's going on interactively. So it's of course much better if you're doing the driving, but if you're watching it, you can understand what the person that was showing you intended you to see. Again, they've got a bunch of different modifications on this. You can show the boundary.
If you had such a thing and you wanted to convert it to a still image, because I think there's a lot of context just from seeing it move around.
Yep.
What are the challenges and strategies you might want to think about there?
And so that boundary gives you an idea of here is the shape of that line on the surface that I've cut the hole through to look at the thing behind.
So you might have to show a couple of images next to each other, and I mean in a paper or something, in order to give that context.
Yeah, I mean I think the idea is the context is mostly the outer surface, and then you're just drilling in exactly where you wanted to see the details.
Yeah.
And here they're doing a different approach to showing inside. You can actually change the rendering inside this opening. So it's a very general approach. I want to have a magic lens. I can look through this thing. Other groups have done things like compute the gradient magnitude, so you can see surface curvature mapped directly to color. You can compute wireframes. You can kind of, inside and outside are 2 different things. But it's a way of mixing 2 rendering styles in the same image that give you both context and the ability to see details. All right. So homework one, as I mentioned, is ready. I marked somebody lead in the spreadsheet. All that means is you should send the email out saying, here's when I can meet, when can you meet, right? Because otherwise there's diffusion of responsibility. Everybody thinks the other person is going to do that, and then everybody thinks nobody's holding up their end of the stick. It's not like the lead has any special magic role. If you're not the lead, you can start the email. I don't really care. Just this will break the tie. So it's going to be due next Thursday, midnight. If there's a question about, how do I open this file or where do I get this from, it's fine to post that to the whole comp mailing list. It's also fine to send it to me and I'll reply to the whole list so that everybody kind of comes up to speed. If it's a question about how would I do this technique or which might work best, come talk to me or send email to me about that. This is like the world's most complicated homework pipeline we have in this class. So there's several things described that you do. One thing is you kind of fill out and make PNG files and VTK files, and you store those in a zip file, and you send them back to me directly by uploading them to an FTP site, right? And you also do a design of the visualization that you put in there on the FTP site, but the design you also upload to the WordPress site, right? And you do that after you have done the whole design so you don't see anybody else's on the way up. Because the new version of WordPress, there's no way to upload your picture without seeing all the other pictures on the way. Thank you very much. Then, after you've uploaded those things on Thursday night, you're going to do reviews of the 2 teams before you in number and the 2 teams after you in number, where you talk about, we're going to have a lecture on doing what a critique looks like before then. But you'll talk about how there could be improvements, what were your favorite parts of that visualization, and particular guidelines that you would have chosen to make other choices. When you do your description, so there's 2 parts that you're going to upload. One is the picture, and the other is the description. And I'm going to be grading both of those, right? So if you get lucky and make a wonderful visualization, it actually won't get you full points. I want to understand why you picked the things you picked. Why did you pick to use a height field for this particular question? How would the user answer the question given the display that you're doing? What were you thinking about that? Why did you pick the background color that you picked? Why did you pick the particular color mapping that you did on top of the display? Kind of all the different reasons. It can be useful as a shorthand to say guideline such and such suggested that, and we followed that. You can also describe, okay, here's the reasoning that you talked about in class. We should be doing that. All right. Right. Already talked about that. Okay. So there's several different ways of displaying 2D scalar fields. There's pseudo-color, and the pseudo-colors lecture here is going to be largely a repeat of what I talked about last class, but from a different viewpoint. It's how would we use this to do the visualization. And this actually bears repeating because it's kind of the most important thing. Every visualization you do in this class is going to involve color choices. And so hearing about it, thinking about it twice can be helpful. Height fields, contours, textures, transparency. Glyphs are going to come in a later lecture on multivariate display, and I'll talk about them more as we go on. All right, so a pseudo-color sequence. The reason it's called a pseudo-color is it's not intended to be a color of any actual object. It's just the color is there to show data, right? And so you want to show some sequence of colors that give you data. And this is talking about initially representing a continuously varying color map using a sequence of colors. We're going to talk about banding next, which is kind of breaking the color into bands and making them the same. This is a continuously varying map. And again, the point here is not to show surface shape, but to lay data on top of a plane or lay data on top of some other geometry. So which pseudo-color sequence? Depends on what you're trying to do. You might be trying to label something, and so spectrum approximation, nominal coding, custom sequences, we'll go through those. And you may be trying to show perceptually ordered values, right? And we're going to look at opponent channels, blackbody saturation scales, and double-ended scales as examples of this. So the spectrum approximation has got some issues. One, it's not perceptually ordered. You have to kind of remember your Roy G. Biv mnemonic to know which order the colors show up in. It's got random banding, right? So it's basically got luminous contrast and large green areas, sudden change, that's not data dependent, but is just based on the color map, right? So this is just a uniform ramp, but it's got all kind of missing structure in it. The structure is not in the data, it's in the color map. And it's got uncontrolled luminous change, right? And so it gets brighter and darker as it goes around the rainbow, and not in an intentional way for doing that. So the active misleading part is, again, these kind of spurious slope misestimations where it looks like it gets suddenly steeper and flatter because of the map, not because of the display. And so it's more suited to the display of nominal data if you just pick the individual bands, and we'll see that a little bit later. But if you're trying to show nominal color, you're going to do even better by just picking what column where 6 colors, and then the second 6 colors if you need 6 more, and showing the data in that way. So again, the easiest answer in this class, the only easy answer is really if I want to show with color a nominal data set, these are the colors that I want to use. So custom sequences can be particular to problem domains, and so here's one that we saw from Tufte's rework that was kind of land becomes more brown as it goes up, sea becomes more blue as it goes down, and it's a double-ended scale, so you can tell kind of where the water edge of the watermark is. So luminance or grayscale is a perceptually ordered mapping that basically picks the brightness channel, which in our eyes, again from last time, is actually the yellow channel, right? Blue doesn't participate in this, but you can draw it as a grayscale. It's perceptually ordered, and the just noticeable difference mapping is known. So what's the just noticeable difference? Right, so if you have 2 different brightnesses, one maybe value 10 on your kind of computer screen and one value 11, can you notice the difference in the brightness there? Right, and the answer is you might be able to, but if it's 200 and 201, you can't, right? And so it turns out the noticeable difference is bigger as the value of the color is bigger. It's a logarithmic scale. So you can see very small changes at low light levels, but you need much bigger changes at high light levels to kind of see the differences. And so you can map that so that you have a color map that is just noticeable difference, and of course it depends on the particular screen you're displaying it on. Okay, the bad news is that basically you can't turn off your surface perception machinery in your visual system, and so this contrast surround effect is happening, so you're seeing how bright something is compared to its background, and you can't make yourself not do this. And so you get 20% average errors on reading a map that's this, not maximum errors. This is like your average error for deciding just what the value is here is 20%, right? So you maybe can get 4 levels of reliable value from this. So it's not as good for labeling. We had 12 colors you could use for labeling. Here you would only have 4 levels you can do.
So what if you just quantized it into
if you quantize
10,
it,
20, 30% or whatever the correct
We're going to talk about banding.
Yeah.
It's coming up next. And there's actually better.
So you don't have to guess about the intermediates, right?
You have the benefit that you can estimate based on distances between contours, yeah. And so banding will be next. So this is, again, for continuously varying map. Okay, some other opponent channels you can use. You can use the red-green channel or the yellow-blue channel. These are, again, perceptually ordered. You at least know that one end is how far from the other, even if you don't know which end is the high end. You put that in your label. You have a choice. You can change the luminance, so it's darker at one end and brighter at the other, and that has the benefit of what? Luminance is used for shape perception, so you're going to see more details in the thing you map to color. It's going to have the deficit that if you map it onto a surface, it'll change the brightness of the surface, which will change the perceived shape of the surface, right? So if you want to show this on a flat plane and you want to see the detail in the color, you want to change the luminance as you go from one end to the other. If you're going to map it onto a surface and you care more about the surface shape, you want it to be isoluminant, you're not going to be able to see the details in the color change, but you're not going to distort the surface as much, right? And so this is a choice you can make. And to deal with the fact that 10% of men are colorblind, you may want to mix so that you're going not just along one channel, along both at the same time. So from green to blue, so there's a blue difference and a kind of green-red difference in the same mapping. So black body irradiation kindred, and kindred is the one I talked about last week. So this is basically you take a cannonball, you heat it up in a furnace, it goes red hot, yellow hot, and then white hot. And so that's basically taking the red channel from 0 to 255, and then the green, and then the blue. You can, of course, pick the other orders. There's 6 orders you can do these in, and these all have the benefit of going from darkest to brightest as you go around, and they all have a map through color space, and they're all basically perceptually ordered to some extent. These blue, because of the brightness change that goes across the display. And so I would always tend to pick the black body radiation spectrum, except if you had 2 different color maps, you didn't want to use the same thing for both. You might want to kind of use 2 of these, one that goes through green, so one's got green in it, the other one doesn't have green in it, and you can get 2 different maps through space.
They're not orthogonal, though, are they?
No.
Yeah.
They're all going to end at white, and they're all going to start at black.
One like
but in
intersect
between,
in the middle. I mean, the 2 of them have yellow, 2 of them have magenta.
Right, so 2 of them, yes, you want to pick one from the red column and one from the blue column. Or one from, so the other thing to remember is, of course, that the blue The good news is the blue in most displays is not purely saturated blue, so it does have some luminance display, but otherwise it doesn't participate in luminance. All right, so you can normalize this. So again, the just noticeable differences depend on the particular monitor you're looking at this on, and this cannot be used for interval data, right? It turns out you still are not going to get good interval. How different this red is from this black compared to how different that yellow is from the white is not something we can measure. All right, there's another thing that you can do is it goes even further through color space, and this is one that Colin Ware actually user tested against a bunch of other color maps, found to be the best. He didn't, in that same study, do the black body, so we don't know how it compares to the black body. We're going to call this, the blue body, the black body plus blue. So this basically says, okay, we're going to go from black to blue, which very slightly increases the luminance because it's not a pure blue, and then go through red, yellow, and white. Right? So this has an even longer path through color space. It's still perceptually ordered. Things go from darkest up to brightest, and it's kind of reusing blue twice, right? So the blue goes up, and then it goes back down as you get the red, and then it comes up finally at the end as part of the white. So it's designed to increase monotonically in luminance while passing through a sequence of colors in either of the two chromatic opponent channels, and it basically minimizes local color contrast effects. All right, saturation scale. And so you can say, okay, I'm going to just take one color and mix it with gray and go from gray to a saturated color. Again, it's perceptually ordered, and you have the same choice, right? If I want to see the details in the color map, then I make the luminance contrast across the display. If I want to map it onto another surface, then I make it isoluminant. All right, so double-ended scales is basically you can take two of these that join together in a common middle ground. The grayscale is an obvious one. You can pick, kind of come up from one direction out to another direction. And the kind of, green to yellow, yellow to red is another approach here. Again, same choice. Do I want it to be isoluminant? Something on the left is more isoluminant. That's more like the color map we see in ParaView. Now, the one in ParaView is actually white in the middle. It's not isoluminant. There is one that's the CIE red through blue that is isoluminant. And again, blue is not playing the luminance equation, so you need to unsaturate that if you want to get the same brightness there. Or if you care about the detail of the color map, then you want to change the luminance as overlaid. All right, so my summary slide, right? So what is it I'm trying to do? I look up in here and try to decide which mapping I want to do. So if you're trying to do a nominal, labeling up to 12 ranges, you want to consider using Collins colors. Ordinal, you want to perceive maximal and minimal areas. You want increasing luminance scales. The black body, if you need to, if you don't have to map it onto a surface, or opponent scales or saturation scales. You can have ordinal with special values for doing ratio display, right? There's a particular place that 0 matters. And it turns out that you can't do interval ratio for any scale, right? So if your hope was, okay, I'm going to find a color map, it's going to let me show interval data, let me show ratio data, the answer is there isn't one, so it lets you do that. If that was the only 2D scalar technique, we'd be sad. But it isn't. Okay, so then rules of thumb that you pick from that channel. More detail, I keep saying this 1,000 times, right? And you'll remember it. Luminous variation is required. Ordered opponent or saturation scales, not hue. Nominal use where it tells colors, and you want this upward spiral in color space. All right, so you might get the impression that, yeah, that's fine on the computer, but in real world, I'm sure I can see these things, right? So here's an isoluminant red-gray color map done in stone, right? And here's a grayscale color map, right? And here's a black body radiation spectrum, kind of with not much black in it. So the question is, can you see, which of these can you see the most details of the little small features on there? Now, of course, they all have different amounts of small features, so this is a little bit of a trick question, but again, this is what happens when you take too many visualization classes and you're in the shopping mall looking at the different displays. Okay, so another approach, beside a continuously varying color map, is to say, no, what we're going to do is indicate isotherms or isoclimes. And this is when you're doing your hiking maps every 10 feet or every 10 meters, it will show you a line. So this is two virus particles next to each other. You can tell which one is taller than the other by kind of counting the steps up. This has got the benefit of every 10th one is white, so you don't have to count bazillion things in between. You can count by tens and then count by ones in between. You can see quantitative data clearly, and so now you can do interval ratio data. You can count, there's 2 steps from this one to this one, there's 2 steps from that one to that one. I get an idea what's going on. And it gives 2D shape of specific regions, right? If I want to know where the land is, then the kind of contour will show me exactly where that is. Banding is contouring, but instead of just putting, kind of the same color of black in between, you just band from, the whole thing. Here we have a black zone, a blue zone, a yellow zone, and a red zone. And again, you can see these things. Now, the black and blue zone is pretty interesting looking, right? It's kind of what is going on there. So does anybody have an idea of what's causing that interesting shape?
Aliasing.
Aliasing, yep, it's a Moiré pattern. Right? This is kind of the kind of expanding rays coming through the screen, intersecting at kind of a constant frequency pattern on the surface, and you get these interesting bands that change shape as you go further back because the spatial frequency changes. Interesting in this case, they didn't expect any black, right? So the researchers thought the whole back would be blue. The black was a bug in their program, and so they found out something about their data by putting in black below 0 where there shouldn't have been any data values at all, showed them, uh-oh, something you didn't expect was here in the data. You should fix it. Okay, here's banding in the real world, right? This is kind of how many people have touched this door at this location banding, right? Can you go for the outer layer of paint, the inner layer of paint, the primer, and then down to the metal, and give you these contours of what's going on. So there's some issues if you're using contouring. One is that you can get contours at non-data relevant values, and they can be confusing, right? There's this very clear, interesting, yet white kind of surface here, and it's like, wow, there's this pattern, what's going on with this? And this is the DNA that's spilled out of an adenovirus, and we contoured just a little too high, so it captures part of the DNA. If you'd gone down further, you'd see this beautiful outline that would show you exactly where the DNA was, but in this way it gives this very interesting pattern, you're wondering exactly what that is. The other thing, and this is partially an implementation issue, is that if you use texture mapping or really any technique for doing these contours, at some place the surface becomes very flat and right near a contour, and the thing just kind of spreads out over the whole thing. And so that's something you can adjust again by just moving the contour line down a little bit. It would disappear, but be aware that these things can happen. All right, so you can of course combine contours and bands, and this is one of my kind of favorite visualizations, at least from the Keller and Keller book. So this is using 2 different contours plus bands, right? And so one contour here is the kind of land-sea boundary, right? And that's the squiggly, narrow one. And you can distinguish it from the isotherms because it's a thinner line and it's generally more kind of fractal looking. Then there's the kind of constant temperature iso lines that are around there. And then there's, they use the rainbow color map, but here the purpose of the rainbow color map is really nominal, right? Because what you want to know is which band over here on the left corresponds with the band over there on the right. Right, so you don't have to trace around all the way through those thin zones to find out which matches up. It does a pretty good job until it gets into the red zone, and there's like an orange and 2 reds that look about the same. But you can follow the contours if you need to find it out. The other thing that this does is very helpful is it puts the numbers right on the contours. Right, this is the temperature. You have to go look up in some legend somewhere to see what the colors are, and they put a contrasting background. Right, so there is no color of text that they could have used that would have worked across this entire display. Because parts of it are very dark, right, very low luminance. Parts of it are very bright, high luminance, and so they basically had to put a background around, so you always have white text on black background, no matter where you are in the image, right? And so this is a very well designed display. It also has kind of the degrees, the local time around the outside, and then a special magic North Pole right there. Right? This is where the Earth spins around, I suppose. That's a really good thing. Okay, so that's a good color. So here's another one that we've seen a couple times. Again, here you can think about all the different contours there are and bands. So here there's contours that show these kind of square national boundary maybe regions. Then there's the contours that show the depth or the height if you're below or above. And then there's these little thin contours that are like rivers. They're actually not really contours around things, but lines that show you kind of individual rivers coming down into this. And so they've separated by kind of curviness or straightness, by thickness or thinness into different contours, and shows several things in this same display.
And there's no gradient there, which is interesting, but discrete colors, right?
And they're using banding with discrete colors in between the contours, that's right.
Yeah. Can you get away with just the discrete colors without drawing a contrasting band?
So they actually have a little bit darker line in between here, and that gives you more luminous contrast between the kind of slightly more yellow, the slightly less yellow, and the even less yellow areas. And so those, this luminous contrast helps you see the boundary better than if it wasn't there. So you wouldn't actually get away with it as well without that. All right, so contours and bands, they are both show the boundaries of the regions you're looking at. They're good for 2D shape of important features. Kind of here's the water line. They give you quantitative interval and ratio measurements, which we didn't get from color maps. The varying width, in other words, as you look at the contours, as they get closer together, you know that it's a steeper, a higher gradient magnitude. As they get further apart, you can estimate slope from these. Not just value, but actually slope, or certainly relative slope. If you put the levels at some ridiculous level, you can get an interesting feature that's not relevant, and it's not as good as height for showing 3D shape, and kind of we'll see that next. All right, so we've seen kind of pseudo-color maps, continuous, then we've seen bands and contours. Now we're going to look at pseudo-height map, right? So height here can be height from a measurement, it could be temperature. You can map any of these things to any other things, and you should think about which one makes the most sense. So you basically are using geometry plus lighting. So here it's the color is used to show shape. The lumens is used to show shape, projected onto a 2D screen. And Ware recommends adding texture and shadows to kind of improve the perception of the display. You can do this with any 2D scalar field. It's a natural one to do for the thing you measured on the AFM, for example, is height. In that case, you may want to exaggerate or reduce the scale, right? The reason to exaggerate is if you want to see small details, you want to kind of pull them up into the perceptual zone so you can see them. If there's a lot of noise, you actually want to reduce it so that the noise kind of folds down and you're only seeing the larger scale features. If you do kind of exaggerate the high scale relative to the XY, you want to let the viewer know so that they're not surprised that you're off by a factor of 10. Mm-hmm. If it's some other field, you can still use height to display it. And you should still think about, okay, should I map this to height? Explain to the users I did this because it's got some benefits, for example, over color, of being able to look at kind of geometry and detail at higher frequency display. If you do a nominal field, of course, you have to impose some order on that. So here's an example. On the left is a grayscale mapping of a data set. This is a surface of holly-horned pyrolytic graphite, HOPG. And so the question that the scientist was asking is, should we make the space shuttle out of graphite? And the answer is, well, there's argon ions that are shooting around in space, and they're going to hit the graphite, and they're going to make it look like this. So unless you coat it with something, probably not, right? Because it's going to be eaten away by the ions. Atmosphere on the right is the same data mapped to a height field and color, right? Now, at the time, I didn't know about the isoluminant color map being a problem, so here it's not an isoluminant color map, so the shape distortion is going to be hard to see, especially in the blue area. But we do see these really interesting features here that are kind of a regular pattern along the edge there. So when you see a regular pattern in computer graphics image, what's the first thing you think about? Aliasing, right? This may be a rendering artifact. And so we studied that and found out, no, there was in fact reasonable sampling across those. These really were ridges, like it was being pushed up along a mountain range, up out of the thing as the ions were hitting. And that can be seen in a particular angle because the light catches them, but it's really impossible to see just in the grayscale because there's not enough brightness contrast between the individual ripples.
The features in the grayscale one are invisible in the other one, or at least.
So you're saying that there's these
No,
features?
those little like speckly things there.
They're here, and from this angle they're hard to see.
They're not immediately obvious.
That's
yeah.
right. So the interesting thing was when I made this video to send to California to show them this. I wasn't there when I watched it. They apparently got halfway through and said, "Stop, stop!" Right? Because from any other point of view, you don't see these little ridges, and so it turned out the lighting direction is an important characteristic when you're doing a visualization design. So something you would think about is color background, but what direction is the lighting coming in? Do I get a specular highlights? So specular highlights show you details very clearly, whereas kind of just diffuse illumination, brightening and darkening, gives you a general idea of global shape. And so you want to pick your lighting direction to highlight the features that you want to see. All right, so this is the pili fibers from bacteria. These are the grappling hooks that they use to grab onto cells and pull in. And this is an atomic force microscopy scan of those, and they're on glass. And so here the height and the color are both mapped to the same data set. And so you can see a couple things. One is these really interesting features. The second is this very interesting striping, right? And so anybody want to guess what the striping is?
Scan lines?
You're right, that's the way the FM tip was scanning. And if you pick a little gump up on the tip, everything looks shorter, taller. If you breaks off something on the tip, everything looks shorter. And so you're seeing the striation is due to the apparatus, not to the data. And then there's these kind of little ripply dimples everywhere, and that's just, again, the noise as the thing bumps up and down over the surface. So you're seeing these details in the context of the large structure.
Now that was a height field to actually represent something that is a 3D object.
This is a height field that represents a 3D object.
Because when you start
and this-
representing 2D things or non-spatial height things in a height field, you're creating structure where there wasn't one before, right?
You're creating geometry where there was no geometry,
yeah.
but you're displaying data in a way that still lets you see details in context.
Yeah.
So if this were a temperature map, you could do this exact thing, and you'd be like, why are there hotter worms on the surface?
Yeah, but I mean, if you overlay that over like a map of a country or something, then you'd be seeing these lumps in places where you know it's flat, and you know, so it could
We're going
kind
to see that coming up. See how we like it.
Yeah.
All right. So
Like
here's an
that?
example. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is, we're going to use height fields for everything because they're great, right? Well, again, for nominal, not so much, right? So what's the political party in Maine, right? Can't see it anymore, right? It's hidden by the other things.
That, who cares?
And so if this was nominal data, where it was, you know, different political parties, maybe there are 5 or 6 of them, neither of these is the best choice. What would be the best choice we've found so far?
Color.
Yep, which color?
The 6-color color
Exactly,
specification.
exactly. So far, that's been the best candidate we've seen for nominal. All right.
Well, the black and white one's not too bad.
Black and white one, except that we know that it's got 20% average error in picking based on what the neighboring states are. And I know you don't believe it, but user studies show.
But how many distinct colors do they, grayscales do they have there? The one looks
Yeah.
like maybe 5.
And well, that's because no matter how many they used, it would look like there were 5. All right.
Okay.
We saw this one before. You know, if you want to see the details on small regions, you want to have all your luminance budget be to the detail contrast, not to, you know, kind of interesting aliasing of the display rendering pattern from the side. All right, so height field characteristics. You can, if you want to see 3D shape, it's the best way to see 3D shape. You can see details in context, which you have a hard time with the contours because they don't happen to pass through all of the details. And you can't do with the color maps because you don't have high enough kind of spatial frequency, don't have luminance variation across the whole map. You can do, I want to say, qualitative interval and ratio data, right? I'm not going to claim we need to do user studies that you can say, okay, this area over here and that area over there are the same height after we've integrated over the mountains and the valleys and some other things, right? And so if you wanted to do banding, it would show you that very clearly, but it wouldn't give you the relative local heights of features compared to other things as well. Not good for nominal data display, features in 2D regions, or, you know, distant areas quantitation. Now, one thing to consider is this, you know, if you're using luminance for this, this forms a surface on which you can display other techniques, right? So we saw you can use color on top to show a second set, contours on top to show a second set, and we'll see examples of that. And so how can we combine these two things? All right, so here's kind of an interesting mixture that came out in 2001. And so this is basically using lighting to say, okay, I'm going to trick you, it's going to view from above, and I'm going to have the lighting kind of get dim and then bright, and then suddenly dim and then bright, and then suddenly dim and then bright, which shows you kind of these kind of stacked on top of things. And you can basically stack these forever, right? And so this is like, you know, contours, but this has the benefit of you know which way is up at every contour. Whereas if you just have contours, you have to kind of figure out separately which way is up. And so this is kind of mixing height and a contoured version of height to show you these things. It still has the benefit of if they're closer together, you have a higher gradient. If they're further apart, you have a lower gradient. And it's an interesting kind of mixture effect. All right, so we've looked at continuous color, we looked at contours, we looked at height fields. We can also use texture, right? And so texture has got a couple of different things you can think about it. One is, it's usually the case in visualization that applying a second technique on top of a first one makes the first one a little bit worse, right? It hides something that's going on. Texturing is the only one where you add texturing and it can make the first one better to understand, right? So if you're drawing things as a height field and you add a texture that's the right texture, you can actually improve the comprehension of the underlying height field in addition to this. It can also be used to display a second or third or fourth data set. If you say, well, I want to display several different things in the same area, I want to use texture as my, one of my channels for doing that. There's a bunch of different parameters of texture, and we're going to go through kind of each of these one at a time. But texture, unlike the color space, where we know pretty well how the visual system interprets it, This is not going to completely, you're not going to completely understand exactly what is going on with texture, right? And I'll show an example at the end where these cookies, where it's like, well, they don't like, we don't know what the 7 dimensions are for, textures. We know the 3 dimensions for color, right? It's kind of like smell. There's not the 4 smells. Taste there is. We know that there's 4 tastes. Smell, more complicated. All right. So this is looking at kind of improving surface comprehension. This picture was intended to help with multivariate display of multiple fields on the same surface. But the fact that it uses this projected from above grid texture, and you see distortions of that texture, shows you the kind of local shape characteristics, right? So as we look from a direction other than straight above, these the surfaces distort the textures, and we can understand both from kind of height, which is hidden by the color, right? So here we get a very strong brightness change here. We don't have a really good idea what's going on there, but this texture coming through here gives us an idea of the shape, right? Improves our understanding of interpolating across that confusing area from color.
So you're calling the grid, the wire grid, texture?
Yep, it's a
Okay.
projected texture. It's orthographically projected from above, and then we're viewing in perspective
And
from
then
the side.
distorted, yeah.
Yeah. So people use this in computer vision to do kind of structured illumination. So you can get depth. This is how the Kinect works, right? If you Microsoft Kinect, it projects this infrared pattern into space, looks at it from the side, and sees the contours of the shape and knows how far things are based on how the pattern goes. We can do that same thing by projecting a texture from not the viewing direction onto a surface. All right, so we saw this picture before, and this is, if we have a translucent surface, pretty much the only way you're going to see anything except the silhouettes is if you put a texture on top. This particular texture is along the principal directions. So what's that mean? So if you have a surface, it's got some direction that there's the most curvature, which is kind of around here, and some direction that's the least curvature, which is up here. Of course, a sphere is degenerate. You can, both of these can be any direction, right? And so the principal direction, this is basically drawing these texture lines along the first principal direction. And that turns out to be an effective way, the most effective direction to show shape. It shows you the curvature of the surface the best, gives you the best understanding of shape. All right, so orientation is one kind of feature of textures, and so this is showing 4 or 5 different directions of textures going. So it turns out that pre-attentively, you can tell about plus or minus 15 degrees, right? And so if you want to be able to show a person a picture and right away they can look for a particular orientation, you can't separate them by less than about 15 degrees, otherwise they have to go hunting to kind of judge what's going on. So the angle of this texture can be a nominal encoding, it can be ordinal or integral, right? How many degrees of rotation could give you data about what's going on? That's not what's going on in this case. Presence of an angle is what's going on in this case, right? So this is 4 different orientations of data. One at this orientation, when there's bright lines at this orientation, that data set is present, and when there aren't, that data set is absent. There's another data set at this orientation, another data set at this orientation, right? And so what this is a way of showing multiple variables, and you can do a couple things pretty quickly. One is you can say, well, there's pretty much only one thing going on here, and it's this data set. You can say, well, there's a lot going on here, and because I've got a black background against all these things, I can say a little bit about which one's brighter than the other, right? What you cannot do is say, well, show me the region of surrounded by the ones with this orientation, right? You have to kind of do something unnatural and kind of look around and see and keep track. It just doesn't pop out the way other things do. And so, orientation is one thing.
Does that have any advantage over, like if you said, oh, here's some data and, trying to find clusters, it seems like you default go to, assign a symbol to each thing and color it a different color, and then, does this have any advantage over that?
Right, so glyphs is an approach you can do, and as you say, you can vary multiple parameters of the glyph to show different data sets. This has the advantage that you can do 7 of them, and they don't interfere too much with each other. Right? Whereas we're going to see with the glyph, you can kind of have...
So you couldn't see, in the bottom? Okay.
Yeah. And so, if you want to see multiple data sets, this is one way to do that, and judge their relative values and see whether a lot of them there or very few of them there.
You could toss some color in there too, which would help.
We're
with
going to
the
toss
first
some color
problem.
in
Yeah.
a little bit later. Good.
Yeah.
All right.
Whoa.
Density, right? So you can, the size of spots gives you another metric of color. You can hear the density varies from left to right, and there's a couple of patches in there. And you all know by this point that I'm going to tell you that those 2 patches are the same size spots. But you don't believe it because they're surrounded by different size spots, and so your visual system is kind of doing the local thing. This is very helpful if you're trying to understand, is this leopard kind of coming towards me or going away? But if you want to know the absolute physical size of a spot on the page, you can't do that. So of course, I always put this in here so you can see that, yeah, and you think, well, maybe he tricked me, and so I'll go back and you can keep your eyes on it, knowing sure enough, there's not going on.
But you are accurately picking up the high frequency change of
Yep.
the dark, right?
Your visual system is a difference detector. It's
Yeah.
not an absolute magnitude detector. And it's really, really good at it across a wide range of channels.
But picking a spot in the middle where it's like the same as one of those would be kind of,
Be hard.
yeah.
Yep.
Is
And I
there
could have
a,
made those a different size, right? And you would have then had no way to tell if they were.
is there a
the same.
size quantization error? I mean, like, if you varied the size of those things by so many pixels where the smallest differential or whatever that
Right, just
acronym
those are the
was?
difference.
Yeah.
I'm sure that there is, and I don't know what the mapping is, right? So
It's not well characterized?
yeah, I mean, I don't know that anyone's done that user study. I'm gonna just guess, if I had to guess, and in my design work, rule of thumb would say probably maybe 4 or 5 levels, right? Same thing that Colin found in the kind of grayscale, but there's a wider range of spot size, so I don't know for sure. All right.
Whoa.
Regularity, right? So you can immediately see whether a texture is regular or irregular, and you can pick out regions of regularity. So we've got a kind of orientation, density, regularity as parameters we can play with. All right. So another approach of texturing dimensions is basically say the same thing we did with the oriented slivers, where it was one orientation meant something. Here it's spots where either color and size means something, or kind of the size of a dimple means something, right? So this is laying on top of each other spots. And so on the upper left is a grayscale representation of a data set. It's multiplied by a regular pattern of spots, and that gives you this representation here, right? So this is a kind of a bumpiness representation. And this is the same thing with spots, and so this is a spottiness representation. Now you can see both of these with respect to each other, right? And you can kind of see, where they overlap, where they're different, where only one is high, where the other is high. And you can also see the boundaries pretty well, right? So the slivers, you couldn't see the boundaries, but you could mix them here. You can see the boundaries, but how much more blue is that than how dimply that is? A little harder to judge, right? So it's not quite as good at relative value estimation, but much better at boundary detection. All right. So another dimension that we have is albedo. So this is basically the surface reflectance, right? And so this is saying, okay, how polished is this surface? So this is kind of got a texture and an albedo data set that's showing 2 different variables. And so this is a TEM EDAX scan of a piece of wiring that was looking at the different gold content and copper content. And so more gold means more ripply at a large scale, and more copper means more kind of fuzzy at a small scale. And so you can see that some of these have lots of gold and no copper, lots of gold and lots of copper, little gold, and you can kind of see these 2 things, going, against each other. And of course, I brought some albedo, the real world things here, right? So here's kind of a interesting speckle pattern. More and more speckles could appear in different places. Cat's eyes rolled off somewhere, right? Here's a different opalescent thing. And this is interesting, right? This is some ribbon, and it changes color when you look from different orientations, right? So the color that you're looking at, it gives you some idea of which way you're looking at it from. Some cars do this because it looks really awesome, cool, and yeah, I'm not sure that one's the most useful for visualization, but it's something to keep in your.
The little speckles make it hard to identify where the surface is.
Yep. And so this is one of the trade-offs I talk about. Yep. The speckle, but yeah. I think what makes it hard to understand that surface is the fact that it's a very shiny, reflective surface with much details. I'm not sure it's the
But you're
speckles.
seeing, I see things that appear to be inside, and I don't know whether it's clear or
Yep.
what.
All right. So again, texture, I haven't kind of given just a good understanding of all the different textures, right? So here is, Whitman's and Cass, 1991, SIGGRAPH paper, where they use reaction diffusion equations to generate a bunch of different textures, right? And so you can imagine that there's 16 of those cookies, and you can imagine 1,000 other of them that were all different from these cookies that also were distinguishable, right? And so if we're looking at something that does nominal coding, now we're starting to see a way to actually go beyond the 12 things we can do with color. So what's the trade-off here compared to color?
Well, there's no obvious relationship between them, right? They're just different.
Yep, that's also going to be true with color. It's going to be abstract.
Takes a little bit longer to see the differences.
Right? You have to kind of pay attention a little bit more to see what's going on.
think it's spread far apart. Some of those it might not be immediately obvious. Like, well, those two zebra pattern ones look the same to me. But
Right, so at some point we're gonna run out of discriminability. But the other thing is, what's the smallest size you could draw one of these and be able to tell that it was this texture, right? So for the giraffe, it would have to be at least as big as one of the texture elements, which is fairly large, right? So color, you can have one pixel be that color. Now, your sensitivity is not gonna be that good point to point, but you can have a better sensitivity in color, especially with luminance variation, than you could with these patterns, right? So there's gonna be a trade-off between the minimum size of the spot you can display in this and the number of different values that you can have. Okay.
is it well characterized what textures we readily recognize?
Nope.
Really?
Right?
Huh.
So we know faces are something that there's built-in hardware in our brains for doing. There's the Gabor filters, there's some theoretical understanding of some of these things, but yeah. And you can find this out if you try to teach a computer how to understand things, and you're like, oh, what model do I build into the computer to do this? I can do Fourier transforms, but that's not gonna give me a really understanding of what's going on. It's kind of one way of looking at it, not a real strong thing.
Also, our brain very aggressively fills in textures, right? So
Fills in
you
color.
take a glance at a patterned wallpaper or something, and you will see the whole thing as uniform, and there can be defects in it, and you have to actually scan very carefully to see them, because your brain will just say, oh, it's all the same pattern,
Yep.
and sort of replicate it.
Yep, the bad news is our brain does that with lots of everything.
Yeah.
So you get on the witness stand and they ask you, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? And then they ask you, was there broken glass? The answer is yes. And if they ask you when they bumped into each other and was there broken glass, the answer is no, right? So you filled in based on the things that you heard. All right, so texture. You can use it to improve understanding of the surface shape. And in fact, if you have transparent shapes, you need to do it to see anything. It's very good for nominal. It's good for ordinal, presence of the texture or absence. And interval you can get with orientation, right? So you can make a little speedometer gauge and give an idea of what the estimate for that is. You can also show multiple data sets, mixing similar texture elements, presence of an element. So we saw that with the spots, we saw that with the slivers. And we're going to have more on that in the multivariate lecture, including adding color as a background to kind of add to the slivers the ability to see that. All right. So now, transparency, right? And so transparency ranks up there with my rainbow color map. That's something that it's easy to turn on and does often terrible things. So you can try to say, okay, let's see through another object, try to compare relative shape of two objects, or display a separate data set. And so translucent surface, of course, this only makes sense in 3D. In 2D, this is just color mixing, right? But basically what happens is if you take this adenovirus that you know theoretically it's shaped like an icosahedron, and you want to say, okay, how much deformation was the AFM scan doing compared to this icosahedron? And you draw the icosahedron in there, and then you draw the texture around. Well, again, the silhouettes, you can see what's going on, but anywhere else, you can't tell what's happening with the texture. So you basically lose the understanding of the shape. If you do this with screen door transparency, where you've got kind of opaque areas and transparent areas, and this is done with kind of a reaction diffusion, kind of naturalistic looking texture, now you can see the front surface based on shape from texture gradient information and the back surface. This actually works if you've got stereo or if you've got motion going on. If you don't, then this is a little bit better than the other transparency. You can get an idea of what's going on, but it's not as powerful as if you have motion. It's doing a hard thing, showing you two surfaces that are kind of co-located in space. All right. The other thing you can say is, well, I'm going to display a separate data set. I'm going to need one to height and the other to transparency, right? Basically, it destroys the surface and you can't see anything. And so the only thing you would want to say is, okay, if it's uncertainty that I'm mapping to the second variable, this makes some sense, right? Because you'll see the surface, the viewer will say, I can't tell where the surface is, and the answer is good. You shouldn't be able to tell where the surface is. We had no idea where the surface is, right? And so it kind of becomes harder and harder to see. A lot of visualization, uncertainty is not considered, right? This is like early on, a lot of graphs, there were no error bars on the graphs, and so you would say these very strong things, oh, this one's always higher. Well, statistically, they're not significantly different. So an idea of how do we, in the visualization, convey the uncertainty, this is one way to do it, but be thinking about that as well. So again, you can use color, right? It's going to make it harder to see what's going on, but maybe matching the verisimilitude or how realistic it looks to the veracity, which is how well you know actually the data that is on there. All right, so it often obscures the closest object. You can see two or more objects, but you're going to need a texture to see what's going on, and it only makes sense when it's combined with surface. Now, the one trick is, as we saw in the video early at the beginning, if the foreground object, really the shape, detailed shape of that's not important, but you want to see the context, this is the head, right, that this is in, then transparency is not going to hurt you the best. It's still going to give you a silhouette, you get an idea of what's going on there, and you can still see through to see the object behind.
So does throwing some specular stuff on the semi-transparent outer surface constitute like adding a texture?
It turns out it's worse, right?
Even in video?
Yeah, so the problem is this. You're going to use stereo alignment or matching to see where that surface is in depth. The light source that is a reflection is not on the surface, right? Because you've got curvature of the surface, so in one eye the light source looks here, in the other eye it looks there. If you believe the light source is consistent, that pushes the surface back, and so it actually makes it harder to understand what the surface is. If you take a little plastic bear, right, it is clear, and kind of look at it in reflected light, you have a hard time understanding what the shape of the thing is. Yeah, so adding textures on the surface helps. It gives you places to line up and understand what gradients are, but just the lighting actually makes it worse. All right, glyphs, we're going to have a whole other lecture on this. As you pointed out, you can vary the shape, the color, the kind of orientation, all kinds of interesting features to see multiple data sets, and we're going to see that in the multivariate display lecture. All right. Very often, as you saw, each of these display techniques has some negative to it, right? And so you can say, well, what we're going to do is remove the negatives by putting multiple techniques on the same data set, and then we're going to really be able to clearly see what's going on. And that's one approach to do. Another thing you can say is, well, science is often about comparing two or more things to see how they relate to each other, and so how can we mix these in ways that you can do that comparison, right? So first we're going to look at redundant encoding, how that can be effective, and then we're going to look at multiple data sets. So here, height and color are both used to display the hole in the ozone layer, kind of reduction in ozone at the pole. And so here they use the rainbow color map, and height to show what's going on, right? And so one interesting thing to look at here is that the dip is in the middle, and there's kind of mountains around it. So from some viewpoints, it can be hard to see the dip. You can imagine inverting that, so low meant taller things, and high meant lower things, and then that would show you kind of standing out the lowness. Then you need to really explain to the viewer what the heck they were looking at, but that may sometimes be a better choice.
So you don't like this sequence?
I do, except for the rainbow color map. It's not isoluminant, and it's got all the other characteristics.
Okay. I'm not having any trouble interpreting it, I don't think.
I know you don't think that you are.
Well, so where am I seeing an error?
You're seeing an error in what the shape of the bottom of this hole looks like, because the luminance contrast there is from the color map, not from the shape of the bottom of the hole. So this is another case where we're looking at an AFM image, and so this is a carbon nanotube that is laid down across a surface that's got gold on it, and then they took the AFM tip and piled up a big pile of the gold there to leave the nanotube exposed. And so it's using basically a golden color map that goes black to red to yellow to white, very similar to the black body radiation spectrum. And so we are going to zoom in here, and so we can see a couple things. One is that there's this kind of sudden change in black to red to white, so you can to yellow, so you can tell that this whole flat surface is about the same height, but you can't see its shape very well, right? So we can't see the orientation changes because we don't have any lighting happening on the surface. You can see that the tube is about the same height as this red thing because it's got a color that matches that. Then there's this gold, and the big hill piled up on top is much higher. You can see the striping pattern here in the yellow zone. That is, again, the problem with the AFM tip picking up and putting down objects as it scans. All right, this is height plus color, using the black body radiation spectrum, showing one carbon nanotube piled up on the top of two others. The color map sort of forms a banding, right? So this is a benefit compared to the grayscale. You've got the red zone, the yellow zone, and the white zone, so you can get an idea of how high this is with respect to this, which we couldn't have integrated from here because we don't even see part of the surface. But this kind of combines a little bit of banding with the height field.
So why is that? Oh, you don't like it because it's not isoluminant.
Right,
Okay.
and so we're not seeing shape here, and the shape gradient here is distorting our understanding of what the surface shape is. right? This is height plus color plus contours, right? So this was when we submitted for the cover of the journal Nature. We wanted to really show people exactly what's going on, right? And so this is carbon nanotube. Again, it's bent. If you bend the carbon nanotube just a little bit, it's like a lead pipe. It gets these ripples that are periodic. If you straighten it out again, the ripples show up in different places. If you bend far enough, it kinks. And you can count. It actually gets more than twice as tall as the rest of the thing. If you straighten it out and bend it again, it's going to bend in the same place. So you've done some non-reversible damage to the tube, right? And so this was showing the two different kinds of ripples on this carbon nanotube that we pushed around. And so height gives you kind of really highly detailed understanding of the local shape. The contours give you quantitative estimation, and the color map helps you kind of know which of these contours matches the other contour across the image.
But doesn't it matter, like, what are you looking for in the picture? For example, you have, like, said that non-isoluminescence, you're not able to see some features.
That's right.
But what you're trying to explain is, like, well, explain it by.
Right, so you're saying it's not too bad that we have a kind of a low brightness color map on the surface, because the surface shape is not what we care about. That's right.
I would question the value of
We could
even.
have picked one that lets you see both of those things, and I think that would have been a little bit better.
Well, I mean, all that red area, the flat, nominally flat, is really not of interest, right? I mean, it's just to put that thing in a plane. So
Yep.
there's not even any reason to have anything other than just maybe a color or just some uniform texture, just to say this is the floor,
Yep, I'll take it, thank you, that's very kind of you. But, yeah.
You know what I mean? It
So
just,
right, so you
it
can't say-
distracts, because I'm
you
looking
could-
at it, I'm like,
you
what
could
are those
pick it
little
as-
blobs?
You
And-
could
yeah.
pick it as a choice and say, we're going to de-emphasize the thing we don't want you to look at, and therefore we picked a color map that kind of hides that, and that would be fine.
Well, I mean, is there anything interesting? Like those lumps in the background, do we care about those?
No, we don't.
Yeah.
No, it's the thing of, like, totally categorizing it that this is not right. It can be, like, from perspective point of view, if you're just trying to explain things with
Yeah.
it does its job, right?
Yep, so you're right. So for this particular set of questions, it's fine to have made that choice. I agree with you. All right. So then, that's kind of using multiple kind of hammers on the same one. You should be thinking about this in your designs for the homework. If you got, if you haven't used contour for anything yet, does it help to add contour, or does it make it confusing, right? Maybe it'll help to do interval values, and it doesn't hurt. Or do you want to add a grid texture on, just to see shape? Okay, quick, stupid peer review trick for doing grid textures. With a calculator, you can calculate a data set that is the x-coordinate and add it to your data. You can then do contouring on the x-coordinate and get contours there. You can do another data set that's the y-coordinate. You can generate contours on the y-coordinate, and you get contours in y. And then you use little eyeballs to turn the surface itself on, the x contours and the y contours all on, and then you've got your instant kind of projected contour on top. It's going to be horribly garish and kind of hide the data, so you go and adjust the opacity or the kind of translucency of the contours, make them fade away, and now you've got a nice kind of not overbearing contour. All right. Displaying multiple data sets. All right. So here's an example where using a non-isolated color map really hurt us, right? And so here the question, these are several monolayers. There's kind of a lower layer, a higher layer, and another layer of three different layers on the surface. And this, so if I ask you the question, okay, is this surface higher or is this surface higher across this boundary? The answer is you can't possibly tell, because any understanding we have of shape is obliterated by the color map having a sharp continuity, right? So here, the color map was showing us stickiness, sideways kind of friction. The height field shows us the height of the monolayers, and these contours are adhesion in the vertical direction, right? So how sticky is it vertically? So we've got the height, mapped to height, we've got the color showing us kind of how much friction there is sideways, and we've got the contour showing us how sticky it is going vertically. So, very interesting thing happens between the stickiness sideways and the stickiness vertically, right? If you look at them side by side, you might say, yeah, they're exactly the same. They're the same shape. But when you overlay them, you say, well, they're kind of the same shape, but there's this weird offset here. And it's not always the same offset, right? Sometimes it's down to the left, sometimes it's up, sometimes it's distorted. What the heck is going on between these data sets? And again, in this case, it was, well, we took the height and the lateral force in one scan very quickly, and then you had to go every point and test and test and test and test and test and test. And the temperature in the room varied by, maybe 2 or 3 degrees Celsius, but we're looking at a square micron, and so that's a significant amount of kind of stretching and stretching of the whole instrument. And so those deformations, again, are instrumentation error, but they show you that these data alignments are not actually collected well. So if you've done your data analysis by kind of saying, okay, I want to look at everywhere inside these contours and sample the other data set to see the height, your statistics would be all off, and you would never really quite understand why. So here we don't have a kind of a friction boundary, so we can see that this one's higher than this one. And for those of you who care, this one is higher than that one. I happen to know because I've seen this from all different points of view. If you've got head tracking, you can kind of get away without, with some of the confusion. Okay. So those are 3 different data sets, the same thing. One to contour, one to height, one to
So you should have had
color.
some fiducials in your experiment so that you could rescale and align the 2 samples, right?
This is good enough to help them answer the question about what they're looking for. Yeah,
But you would have liked
actually
for
do
it to line up, yeah?
So you could have done a lot of kind of computational math and assume some non-rigid deformation would line things up, or you could just visually look at it and say, yeah, I see what's going on here, depending on how deep you want it to go. If you want to do analysis and line them up, then yes, indeed, you're going to have to do some non-rigid deformation. But then you do have fiducials, right? You've got these contours here are going to match the edges of the contours there. All right, so this is the old diner table, right? They've bleached it one too many times, and the texture is rubbed off of it. This is Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. This is a compact disc, right? So if it was blown up to full size, it would go around the Durham and back. And so these are the zeros and ones kind of encoded on the surface of, kind of 3 different tracks going around the CD. And so the height is mapped to the height. And here the lateral force is mapped to kind of presence of texture, right? So it's very slippery here. There's more sticky over here. In this case, it's because the tip was scanning this way, so it ski jumped off and then kind of jammed up against the side. It gives you kind of a view of both height and lateral force at the same time. So this is height, color, and intensity. And so height and color are mapped to the same data set, the atomic force microscope data set. And then the kind of another intensity is mapped to the grayscale image that is the scan electron micrograph lined up with these 2 things. In this case, you could actually adjust the relative mixture of these 2 things to kind of highlight one versus highlighting the other. And again, non-isoluminant color map, especially one that has black in it, gives us a hard time understanding what the shapes are of these surfaces. So here was, you were asking about what if you map this onto the United States, right? So this is Wired Magazine a couple months ago, looking at where the people who write back to the Food Network come from, right? And so they've done this with the kind of mostly isoluminant color map, and they've used a contour. Now the problem is, as you say, you've got these weird bulges and you don't know where they line up, right? So is that bulge, where is that bulge? Well, their solution to that problem was to actually put little fiducials that show you where particular cities are to give you an idea of, where these bulges are. Again, we have a hard time seeing some stuff happening over here in Maine, and you have a hard time counting your way up these, but this is, it does a fair job of showing you these things all in one display.
Seems like doing that in 2D would have been a lot less confusing.
Well,
if they kept the contour lines and
figuring
the
out
colors.
this quickly gives you a relative height estimation and slope estimation that you have a hard time getting just from contours or from color. Black body radiation might have been fine, but you don't get the visceral feel for how much bigger the area is than others. All right, so this is color plus a model. So here we're not mapping color onto kind of a surface, but onto a 3D model. And so it was a poor choice to use non-isoluminant map because we're going to see perceived distortions. But you might say again, well, we know what the shape of the shuttle is. We've been dealing with the shuttle. We're the engineers, so that's not going to hurt us so much as you might think. And so it's giving you an idea of the pressure as the shuttle is kind of coming down and landing, and you're going to see where the strains are on the...
See, that seems like a very intuitive coloring. And I didn't know what you were measuring, but I figured the red things were a high level of something, right? Over a surface that's fairly obvious. And
Yep.
you've got some shading in there, right, to help you see the surface, right?
The shading is going to fight with this, and so you're not going to see...
I mean, you can sort of pick out the fuselage and the wing and the curve of the nose and that kind of stuff from the... Or is that
I think
imaginary?
because you know what that shape is, you can understand what that shape is. If you didn't know what that shape is, you'd maybe wonder why there's a divot here and kind of pulls you down. All right, so this is an interesting one. This is mapping a height field over a model, all right? And so this you need to think about a little bit more. So here we've got kind of wherever there's high pressure, so this is the boundary layer thickness basically stretches the surface of the model out, right? These contours help understand what the shape deformations are. The fact that you've got another side over there gives you maybe a context to show this in, but this is an interesting way of saying, okay, I can very clearly see high and low local variation very well because of the height field, but I'm gonna not understand the shape of the shuttle so well. In this case, I don't think they were worried about deceiving themselves about the shape of the shuttle, and so I think this could be an effective technique for showing highly detailed features compared to kind of other features from the display. All right, the potato Earth, right? So this is looking at magnetic field deformations, gravitational field deformations at the surface of the Earth. So you've got a kind of a height field that is the highly detailed height field that is the continents. They give you an idea of where on Earth that you're looking. And then you've got both a color map, unfortunately the rainbow, but also a deformation of the surface. So the whole Earth gets, kind of smaller where there's less gravity, bigger where there's more gravity. And so this is another deformation of height on height. There's a high frequency thing that lets you get context, and the low frequency thing gives you that. Unfortunately, the color here is going to exaggerate the changes in depth because it looks like there's more change because you get more luminous contrast than you would have just for a dip there. But silhouette, kind of interesting, yeah.
Not to scale.
Not to, what would that mean?
Well, I mean, the Earth is not shaped like, I mean, they're I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a height map on top of an object. It's
Yep,
like, what
it's weird.
what am I looking at? Yeah,
Yep, it's
the Earth
weird.
is not shaped like that, yeah.
Actually, that anomaly in India is 100 meters exactly beyond, so it is not a scale because we are talking in meters in GOE, and when you talk about
100 meters, but gravity's not measured in meters. What do you mean by that?
No. The gravity anomaly that's just near the.
This one here?
Yeah, I remember looking at that GOE. It's about 100 meters below. So basically, if the Earth is a sphere,
Yep.
and if you're on a ship,
Uh-huh.
the ship will sink about 100
I see. So you're saying the surface of the ocean is actually
Yeah,
deformed
well,
down that much?
gravitational surface. So if you took a surface, you went around the Earth and you were going for everywhere where it's.
An isogravity
Yes.
sense.
Yeah, so it just
Okay.
sinks about 100 meters.
I
It's
see.
really-
I see. So you're kind of saying the iso weight surface, right?
That's
If I was going to weigh the same amount, how high do I have to be off the Earth? Now I got you. Okay. I was trying to figure out how you were converting from meters per second into meters, and the answer is yeah, unit mass, right? You go, okay, that's cool. So that would be an interesting way to think about. Yeah, how high do I have to go up to weigh the same everywhere? All right. So this is kind of the enriched contour lines that we saw, along with color and contours, right? So the contours are showing us the land-sea boundary in Europe.
Huh?
This is contours. This is looking at, average temperature, and then precipitation is height, right? And so you're looking at the relationship between temperature and precipitation, and, there's low temperature here, low precipitation. There is, you don't have measurements all over the Earth, right? And so you're comparing these two different things in January versus July. So the good news is you can do kind of a interval estimate of the height of the precipitation, and you can also get a kind of global idea of how much larger it is or smaller, and then you can compare that against color. So here you're going to get more detail from the precipitation than from the color, and so presumably the color has the temperature changes slower than the precipitation rate, which I would believe.
So one thing you can't tell necessarily the absolute magnitude of like that little blob over Scandinavia and that little blob over, what is that, Germany?
You'd have to do a lot of counting.
Yeah, so they
Yeah.
look like they might be the same height.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 8.
I mean, where's
9,
0?
7, 6,
Yeah.
5. But yeah. And so again, you can help that if every 10th one you put some special distinguishing characteristic, and then you can count those much faster. All right, another kind of zoom in on that color versus precipitation as well. So this is trying to do an SEM image with EDAX, so we can see 3 different materials. So there's the SEM intensity, was mapped to color, how much iron there was, how much sulfur there was. So we tried to match sulfur to this hash texture, tried to map this to color, and what is mapped to bump? Hash. So
Bumps
this-
look
sorry,
like iron.
This is mapped to bumps, right? So this is where there's iron, this is where there's sulfur, And the problem is two things. One is where there's both, you can't tell how much hash there is because the bumps interfere. And the second is it's hard to tell the surface texture except for where the light hits the surface. So you're going to have to move the light around to see. So this didn't work out so well as we'd hoped it would.
Showing us a lot of like anti-patterns.
Yes, and I see a lot of anti-patterns in homework, and I'm going to keep showing anti-patterns to help divest you of the idea. Because I mean, we wandered for like 3 years down this path of, well, we're going to do height, and we're going to do color, and we're going to do texture. And then we do the fourth thing, and it would fail. Okay, we're going to do texture, and then we're going to do height. And you could pick, the first three, it always was great, and you put the fourth one in there, and you know, it all fell apart. And I've got a whole lecture on what do you do about it in the multivariate lecture coming later. And the slivers and the spots were kind of the first ones where the student said, look, we're just going to not think about layering things. We're going to pick one thing, and we're going to do it. And I said, no, that'll never work. That's ridiculous. And they did it, and it worked great, and you know, voila. So now I'll teach you how to do what I said not to do. All right, so this just was completely horrible. Right, so this was, you know, 3 colors, right? Red, green, blue. And then we're going to have a hash pattern, and then we're going to have this checker pattern, and the checker and the hash are hard to see. The hash doesn't resolve itself very well. The idea was you would have the orientation of the hash be dependent on one texture variable, but you get aliasing, and it just turns into mush, and you know, don't do this. All right. So for image textures, here, this is again the oriented slivers, and this is literally 4 orientations of carbon nanotubes with Raman spectroscopy. So it's like one's oriented this way, this way, this way, and this way. And again, you can tell, okay, there's not so many of them here, there's more of them here, what the relative values are. Or, if you're looking at SEM data, we can do what you suggested and say we're going to use color as one thing for the background. Now you can see both very clearly the things that are above the average background and the things that are below. Right? So these hashes didn't appear in the previous image because they were the same color as the background. This shows you kind of above and below values, and you can see them, both of them, pretty quickly. And you get a nice region due to the color map that shows you, okay, let me see the segmentation I'm looking for. All right, so this is Alexander Witkowski looking at 9 different data sets. Right, so here's the 9 data sets kind of shrunk down. And each of these is this whole size over here, right? So if I ask you which data set is this, you know, which kind of spot pattern is this mapped to?
Small blue dots.
Small blue dots. Yep, and so you see the mushroom, here's the little mushroom. Down here, which one is the tub?
It's not immediately obvious.
Seems to be a texture, like a little
The little red
small
dots.
bumps.
Yep, your little red dots. All right. And so what happens is, now I'm not saying you can suck in all 9 data sets at once, but what Alexander showed was that you could, for any 2 of these, pairwise compare them and do as well as if you just draw on the contour of the overlap. So this both lets you see the relative values and kind of where they overlapped in contour. And so it's a way of intentionally let you see up to 9 data sets, 2 of which you care about, 7 of which are distractors, and see this. And there's no other technique that we've come up with that's kind of come close to doing this.
There are regions that were, they all just, it's a mishmash. You
Yep,
can't
there's a
tell
lot
it's-
going on here.
Yeah, and down in the.
And so, for example, the big bumps, you can't show super highly detailed things with the big bumps because they're big bumps. But you can, let me see. Yeah, so there's a fundamental trade-off between texture and color. All right, so some hints, 2 techniques. You may need to flatten the data, right? And so here is kind of these adenovirus with the DNA spilled out, and however it happened to line up in the AFM, the contours kind of come uphill, don't tell you much about what's going on. If you take the data and you apply a shear to it so that the 3 corners go to 0, you still draw the geometry at a slant, but the contours and color come up from the flat surface. Now it's kind of an analysis relevant visualization as opposed to happen to be in the coordinate system that I got it in visualization. All right, so there's several different techniques that are available. Each is more appropriate for some things and less appropriate for others. And you can combine them to kind of hide mask the kind of negatives of some data sets or to show multivariate display. And there's going to be some other techniques. Animation is probably coming in a later lecture unless it gets voted off the island. And then definitely in the multivariate display lecture, we're going to see sequential, side-by-side, stacked, and glyphs. All right, so the homework is out there. Get up with your partner, figure out how you want to work together on putting it together, and send me an email if you have questions about how things are going.